threats from states, from non-state actors, from proxies, in some cases from even highly trained individuals. So it's a diverse landscape. And these threats take place in a variety of, within and across a variety of different domains. And these are the challenges that we need to confront as a nation and with our partners. We can look at issues like what we're hearing about going on right now and for the last several weeks in Ukraine, in the conflict between the Ukrainians and the Russians. We can also look at issues like recent attacks by the Houthis in the United Arab Emirates using drones and missiles. We could also look at issues like how the People's Republic of China is leveraging maritime militias in the South China Sea to gain influence and shape things to their specific goals. So there's a lot of other different examples as well. And so, sir, I want to turn it over to you for the first question. And as you think about this landscape and the evolution of how things are changing, what does that mean for how we compete? And how do you assess that situation and think about it?
Yeah, Don, thanks. And it's an honor to be here. And I'll tell you, for my first ever live podcast with a live audience, and especially to be with the cadets. So thanks to you. And I appreciate being here alongside Dr. Elias today and having looked at some of her work, which is really important study. A couple things I'd hit. One, our near peer adversaries, I think, have more capability and are probably willing to use it in ways that we haven't seen before, would be point one. Point two would be that they still will not necessarily approach the U.S. or anything in a direct manner. They're going to approach it from asymmetric manners because they've seen the lessons over time and they've studied it. So why try to face the U.S. head on head when you can in fact go around and maybe not force and try to do something that would cause us, but instead cause us to do something in response, but to do things that are slow and nefarious and the asymmetric approach towards the U.S. And the third thing that I'd say, and I could bring up more, but the third, I think, really important one today is inside the information space. That our adversaries are willing and continue to compete in this space by sowing misinformation and disinformation, by actually attacking and throwing out false narratives and they realize how important it is. We all saw, 20 years ago that the internet would be a place for good. But what we're seeing more and more, it's a place that can actually sow those seeds. And all you have to do is watch, as Mr. Rassler was just talking about, how much Russia is playing in this space just today in Ukraine. And I think we, as military professionals, need to be taking that in consideration and talk about the things that we should be doing to counter that, but also to make sure that our own messages and what is the truth are being amplified. So I'll pause there.
Dr. Elias, what's your view? With your background and experience in research, are there particular pieces of work from the academic community that you think are helpful for us to understand how this evolving times and these moments that you think could be helpful for as we navigate these different challenges?
Yeah. Well, I also want to just say it's an honor to be here, and I'm thrilled to be here with General Clarke, and thank you for the invitation and for your time. It's really interesting also to hear the General speak about the capabilities as they're evolving at this current moment and how everything is absolutely in flux and changing. And perhaps I've studied insurgency a little bit too long, but I think that if we learn a little bit from kind of an insurgent strategy is if we could adopt a very long timeline, a very long expectation in terms of how we're going to have to be responding, appreciating, learning, instead of thinking, oh, we'll just get this and then move past it. I think irregular warfare and the information that we're going to have to be dealing with in terms of the battle space is going to be here to stay, and we need to really process that and think about it. Another thing I wanted to talk about too was to think about how ways that we can think about making it costly for our adversaries to use those kinds of techniques, even if you can't have a definitive military victory, a surgical strike or something along those lines. But how do we just turn things and make it costly for them to expand their capabilities kind of in the irregular space there? And in terms of the academic community, a lot of academics have done fantastic work on civil wars in particular, and on examining really complex details about where do insurgencies come from? How do civil wars end, for example? And so there's those key complex processes that involve a lot of different aspects of warfare, both in the regular and irregular spaces, kind of pulling those things together. So there's some really good work happening there. And in terms of security force assistance, there's a lot of really good work that's being done at this moment. And I think in the next couple of years, we'll hear from a lot of up-and-coming scholars about security force assistance in particular and on alliance management. Yeah.
Can I pull on what Dr. Elias just said and then give a thought, but then come back to her? When you talk about make it difficult for our adversaries, and I'd make 2 points and then try to get the conversation going. One, when we talk about making it difficult for our adversaries, I think we really have to be specific on that point, because different adversaries will have different pain levels or different areas where you say it's difficult. As a young officer growing up, we really only had, when I graduated from this place in 1984, we were 100% focused on the Soviet Union. We studied order of battle. We knew what they were all about, and we understood what it would take for a coalition of forces to make it painful on the Soviets. I think we have studied terrorism for the last 20 years, but I'm not sure that we can view a Russia or a China with the same lens, and what is costly for our adversaries in those in the various spaces, whether it's in the information space or whether it's land, sea, or air domains. And I think we have to look at that harder and make sure that we understand that. I'd come back to Dr. Elias and try to get a thought from that.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. You absolutely have to have context-specific information and also context-specific understandings, which also brings us to the point where what Kyle was bringing up too, in terms of thinking about local partners. That's where a lot of the local information comes, to get the context-specific information that you need in order to very carefully and with a very keen eye for understanding exactly the motivations, the capabilities, and then mapping out the potential consequences for a response. So I couldn't agree more that it has to be specific to that particular context in terms of complicating the situation for them. And there's a lot of risk. It's a lot of risk in terms of managing. You're going to be risk acceptant, you're going to be risk adverse, and trying to map out a lot of the consequences for potential action. Absolutely true. That's why you need a lot of really good, fast, quality information, which is difficult, especially in the age of disinformation, right? So all of these things are happening, which creates a very complex set of circumstances. So I think that's absolutely true. It's just the idea, though, of kind of not making, the idea, though, that it wouldn't be something so specific and targeted, but something that could be more akin to kind of just slowing things down for your adversary when they're making an action.
It'd be helpful, I think, to pick up on these threads that both of you have talked about, making it costly. And one component of that, as you both know, is about signaling and also about issues like deterrence. And so I'm just wondering if when you think about how things are evolving in the environment, and that we understand conventional deterrence, but in this irregular warfare context with a variety of different threats manifesting in different ways, figuring out how to make it costly in that type of context, Just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, and particularly, there's been a lot of discussion and talk about this concept of integrated deterrence, and what integrated deterrence means. It's, people have said that it's going to be a cornerstone of the next national defense strategy, and so I think this is an important topic to pull on this thread of costs. If either of you have a perspective on this, what these changes mean for deterrence and integrated deterrence specifically.
Yeah, a couple things. From my standpoint, I'll turn over to Dr. Elias. I think we still have to completely look at the fundamental areas of deterrence. Deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment. And we can never forget those two critical parts to it. But still, when we go to thinking about deterrence in a less than kinetic or maybe an asymmetric aspect, we got to think, how are we deterring those lesser things that aren't seen, that may not have much attribution, that you can't, there's no physical manifestation of the act, whether that's in cyber or you may not see it in space. It's the hard to prove pieces can become challenging. And so I think we have to think through those and look at what is the most essential to prevent, and what do we have to protect so that you can deny an adversary and this, and where are we actually going to go with punishment and signal to our adversaries, if you do that, there could be punishment to it, or there will be punishment to it, depending on the policies that are related. As Mr. Rassler just hit, the integrated deterrence that is going to be the cornerstone of the next national defense strategy is important, and something that we all have to, as practitioners in this, start to understand. And that's really approaching deterrence not just from the military aspect, but all instruments of power being brought to bear, the diplomatic, the informational, the economic, and making sure we approach this from a whole of government perspective. Vice, hey, we're just going to show the military instrument, and it becomes a mano on mano thing. We really have to approach it from a broader perspective.
So before we shift gears to our next theme, I think it'd be helpful to try and drill down and just get a quick perspective from both of you about examples that, when we talk about how the competitive landscape is evolving, that jump out to you and say, oh, I think about this particular operational case or this issue where it makes sense to you. Do you have a helpful one that you can share with us?
I'll throw a few things out there. When we did the raid on bin Laden in 2011, we flew into Pakistan, conducted the raid, flew back out. It was an incredible mission, complex, a key mission. A couple months ago, we did a raid against the senior leader in ISIS. What I would share with you is a significantly tougher mission. Why? Because in that particular mission, we were flying through a Russian and Syrian airspace, with high-end electronic warfare and air defense systems that could have shot down one of our helicopters. We were more concerned about other threats than what would actually occur on target of the ISIS leader than we were about the actual mission, because we had to successfully get through that. So that's one really important thing, is that the ability of our enemy to see and sense where we are today is significantly greater, and the capabilities that they have, like electronic warfare, like air defense systems, but then also one that should cause us all cause for concern is the UAS use that our enemies are using, the unmanned aerial systems, that they are now flying to great degree. And the way I look at UASs today, we could take them. They're the improvised explosive devices of 2003 and 4, but now they have wings, and now our enemy can fly them to a time and place of choosing, putting our forces at risk in the combat zones, but also that technology and the capabilities expanding. And so that's going to continue to be a threat for all of us going forward.
Dr. Elias, does the case come to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, like, speaking to General Clarke's point about the difficulties of maneuvering and the complexities and the lack of clarity in terms of like, this is your target and hit it. It's also when we think about deterrence, also thinking about the role of proxies and non-state actors and how you have lots of states, and the case that comes to mind is Pakistan. Pakistan has lots of proxies. Iran does this too. So they can deny that they themselves are, in uniform doing a certain activity, but they use proxies, insurgents, terrorist groups, what have you. And then that makes deterrence a lot more difficult. And then it also complicates a potential American response, right? So just to add that to that.
Perfect segue.
Yeah.
So,
and if I could rip before
yes,
you go into that,
go.
I mean, and I take Wagner Group, take Wagner Group in Syria, take what they're doing in West Africa, and to be able to put a degree of separation between them and the state really provides that degree of ambiguity in this, which makes it harder to deter. And I think it's important for all of us to be thinking about it. But you could put it on the flip side. There's also a risk to using proxies from a state actor, because then if they are doing things that aren't in accordance with what your wishes are, it can also boomerang back on you. So,
totally. Well, Pakistan is a perfect case of
yes.
that, right? They were the spinoff of the TTP, and anti-Pakistan Taliban is also a huge security threat within Pakistan now, right? So dealing with that, and has been for quite some time. So, yeah.
Again, perfect segue. So the second thing that we want to hit on is this issue of intersections, and particularly related to our national security priorities. And so proxies sit right at the heart of that. And so as both of you are aware, the 2018 National Defense Strategy identified strategic competition is, when it comes to national security priorities, that's our guiding light. That same document also identified terrorism as a persistent challenge. And we have been going through over the past several years a rebalance, where we are working to figure out how to manage that in practice and what that looks like. And so when we think about issues like strategic competition and also counterterrorism and irregular warfare more broadly, in the minds of both of you, how do those issues nest? Where do they nest? How should we think about them?
yeah. When I took over SOCOM in 2019, my first trip was, the first country I visited was the Philippines. I went to the Indo-Pacific first. And while we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq, almost 18 years at that time, consistently, and truthfully, probably all my predecessors, for the past 18 years had gone into the Central Command region. I said, China's a priority, but there's also counterterrorism. And there was a big counterterrorism threat in Philippines. And if you look at the Indo-Pacific region, the Philippines is the only named operation in all of the Indo-Pacific. Our forces, the SOCOM forces, team with the Filipinos, helped defeat a very heavy Al-Qaeda threat. I mean, if you could go to the city of Marawi, where they had absolutely destroyed that city. It was like scenes from Raqqa and Syria. But I bring that example up, but because we're in the Philippines and partnered with a very capable force, with a trusted force from the U.S., and in this case, SOCOM forces, it provides us access and placement into an area with a trusted partner that allow allow you to be there and see and sense what is happening in the region. And you could take that same scenario and play it to other countries in the region, because our forces are culturally astute, they're language proficient, and they understand the operating environment where they are. And it assists moving from a counter-violent extremist to naturally to be able to compete in a near-peer competition because of that access and placement. And it's really working with partners that you build that trust over really decades that allow us to conduct those type of operations.
And absolutely. I would also say that sometimes when we think of this trade-off between counterterrorism and strategic balancing, I'm not sure our adversaries see them as separate tiers, right? One is very much, you use the word nested. I think that's right. It's just a different type of tool for the same end game.
And it's a hard thing to get right? So we are obviously want to do the best job that we can on both fronts, but that involves trade-offs, and it also involves us thinking about issues like efficiency. Do you have any advice or thoughts about how we can approach that particular issue, about how we think about trade-offs when we're trying to do the best job, compete effectively against countries like China, while also managing a persistent terrorism threat? It's an easy thing to talk about in practice, but the real nitty-gritty of managing it is tricky.
Yeah.
Do either of you have any thoughts about how we should approach thinking about trade-offs, or what are there specific trade-offs that come to mind when we talk about those two issues?
Yeah, I think what Dr. Elias was saying and what you're getting towards is, from my perspective, is there's this continuum, and you can't go, all right, we're just in competition, and now we're in crisis, and now we're going to go back to just fighting counter-violent extremists. Competition is a continuum. And I think all of us would much rather be in a continuum of competition, vice the alternate, which is being a great power war. And there's some that try to say we're in competition, then it goes to crisis, then it goes to conflict, and almost like they're phases. And I think if we approach and I think really heavily, as we think about irregular warfare, we shouldn't try to think of it as a phase where we go to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, because I think we do that to our own demise. So, as professionals, I would ask you to think of the competition, including crisis and including potential, the fight against violent extremists, and that's all in that continuum.
So it seems like in this environment that, in the various domains that are involved, that it's obviously more of a joint fight. It's more of an interagency fight. It's more of a joint force fight. Are there particular ways that we should think about approaching the interagency in relation to things like the economic aspects of things like irregular warfare, where the special operations community's role in an area like that is less clear, but obviously it can also potentially be critical to supporting the interagency?
Yeah, I'll go first, and then turn to Dr. Elias. 9/11 occurred, and the 9/11 Commission report was published, and key finding was that there were a lot of stovepipes of excellence that weren't talking with each other, and there were a lot of data points of things that weren't shared from an intel perspective. I think I would suggest that since 9/11, the interagency coordination, specifically for countering terrorism, has increased dramatically. I was able to witness it firsthand over the last 20 years. of that interagency coordination. Today, while we're sitting here, USSOCOM has over 125 liaison officers in DC working in the interagency. At SOCOM headquarters, I have about 35 interagency seniors that work at our headquarters to ensure that collaboration is moving back and forth. It's exceptionally well done for that fight, and all of the things like counter threat finance, going after command and control of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and ensuring we're sharing on the intel side are critical to being ahead of that fight. But I would say we don't necessarily have an interagency coordination to the same degree against in an irregular warfare method or design. And I think if it would take a complex problem and a specific problem to drive that.
Sure. The importance of internal partners and further developing those here within the United States government, but also how we approach external partners. Dr. Elias, you have literally written the book on partners in the coin, large-scale coin interventions, award-winning. It's an excellent book that looks at why the limits of the United States' ability to influence our partners through key case studies. When you think about partnerships and the lessons that we have learned through your research, looking at partnerships and the limits of our ability to influence partners, and thinking about the future and this environment evolving, what lessons would you share about lessons learned from kind of where we've been so we can get better about moving forward?
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting and what's popped out in my research would be really interesting to hear General Clarke's perspective as a practitioner in terms of working with allies, but local allies that are paired with Americans in a security space. And I looked at large-scale counterinsurgency interventions, which is a particular form of problematic alliance, but that allies are often trying to manage us, Americans, as much as they're trying to manage terrorists.
It's a two-way street, you're saying?
Yeah.
Is that? Yeah, okay.
As well as lateral threats internal to their own regimes. They're playing a very, very complicated balancing act, political act within their positions, right? So it's not just that when the United States comes and may have some policy recommendations or want to partner with them, those policy recommendations often have repercussions that they're deeply internal and problematic for those allies. As obvious as certain reforms might be to an American perspective, it is interpreted very differently on the ground by those partners. And so I think appreciating that difference instead of resenting that difference may be part of what I have uncovered. So one example, one big example, which is not in the book, but which I've been thinking about, reflecting on the U.S. war in Afghanistan. But one moment, I think, if we think about how do we manage or really engage in an honest, clear-eyed interaction with partners. I'm thinking about U.S. approaches to Pakistan in 2001 and 2002, and what would the world look like if American policymakers at the time had approached Islamabad and said, what is a regime in Kabul that you could live with, that we could live with too? And it's, that Rolling Stones song, you might not get what you want, but you could get what you need type of thing. Understanding that Pakistan as a state had built up the Taliban and had essentially enforced, or had supported the Taliban rise to power throughout the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And so at that point, I think, looking at that, at Pakistani interests in the Taliban regime, in that moment might have really yielded some interesting, more clear-eyed kind of negotiations between the U.S. and its allies. Yeah.
Hey, Don, could I ask Dr. Elias a question and try to pull on a part here with allies from her work? Because you made the point earlier, allies trying to manage us. Yeah. Which I, for the cadets here and those out, you very likely could be working with partner forces. And the question that I want to try to pull on a little bit is, what in your research of the security aspect of this, where U.S. working with with an ally, or in most cases a partner, say the Afghan security forces, but then tie that to your research on the Afghan security forces to the government. Because many times you'll be on the ground working with Afghan security forces, but then how does the government tie into this? And then what should the lessons learned between the government to the Afghan forces, and maybe some of those things you uncovered during your research on trying to influence at the ground level, but also influence at the governmental level?
Yeah. Well, I think Afghanistan is a particular case because there was not, my understanding of it is that there was not a sufficient amount of institutional ties between the Afghan security forces and then the Afghan state itself. That was one of the key kind of crumbling blocks that was underpinning the Afghan regime. And so that was a big problem. My research predominantly focuses specifically on the political piece of it, not on the security piece of it per se. And that's also why it's really exciting that there's other people, other academics who are really also working on the security force piece of it. But what I would say in terms of how they manage us, I mean, that it's, at least on the political end of it, if I could push that piece, the regime in Kabul had a lot of approaches to managing Americans, and that could be anything from deception to foot dragging to feigned compliance to all kinds of different techniques. And again, this isn't necessarily to say, as a moral condemnation of the regime. It's just to say that it's a very complex political set of circumstances, and I think that taking a clear-eyed perspective on that would have given the U.S. a lot of insights, or at least the diplomats a lot more insight in terms of how to actually manage those partners. Yeah.
But I think it's really important. And we just used Afghanistan, but I could tie that to Iraq. I could tie that to the Philippines. I could tie that to many different countries that we that are working with partners have to understand on the ground the capability of those, but what are they pushing on, and what is their government support, and what are those ties? And there's many lessons learned from maybe not creating a force in our own image, looking at what their capabilities are, and maybe not doing, not trying to get them to do something or build a force that is not necessarily in their interest, just because it's what we do. And I think we all have to look really hard at that, along with future capabilities and future funding for those security forces. From the political side, is it going to be sufficient? Is it sustainable?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And also thinking about how it's possible to also assess what's there that's already working. If there are things that are working, instead of saying we have a plan out of a box and I think this theory is really great and let's put that in. So in terms of what we build and what we do. And then also you've mentioned interagency dynamics within the United States, but interagency dynamics on the ground as well. And then saying what is actually possible given the political constraints and what might actually be sustainable and might live on. Yeah.
So your book focuses on large-scale COIN interventions.
Yeah.
And some of the things that we talked about in terms of the competitive landscape and irregular warfare are likely to also take place in small-scale intervention environments. And so just curious if you think that there are components of maybe your findings that you think might be different if it were in a small-scale context.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that is a paradox of counterinsurgency interventions that I found in my book, at least, were that the more you invest, the less leverage you have. Because essentially you've tied your fate to their success in terms of your local ally, right? One U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan described it as the scene in Blazing Saddles, where essentially the moment is the main character is saying stop or I'll shoot, but the gun is pointing to his own head. Like if you undermine, and the ambassador said that I can't threaten to harm Karzai, because then what happens to the American effort if his regime falls apart? Like it makes no sense. So the more that you invest in a local partner, the less leverage or the less coercive influence, the less credible your threat becomes to actually say you need to implement these changes, or we're going to do harm, or we're going to withdraw, economic support or what have you, becomes less credible in that way. So I think with the a smaller commitment, or at least a smaller implementation of force, actually comes with a larger and more expansive toolkit in terms of potentially coercing allies or incentivizing, or however you want to talk about the different potential ways to leverage your position there. But you lose a lot of leverage actually when you invest more in an ally, and they know it.
So we've covered a lot of ground. We have an audience waiting here to ask some questions. So we're going to start the question and answer session. We talked about how the competitive landscape's evolving, intersections, trade-offs, partnerships, the Rolling Stones in Pakistan. and so there's a lot that we talked about tonight. We're going to open it up. So who here in the audience here would like to ask a question? Please come up.
Sir, you mentioned how important it is to rival China in the Indo-PACOM theater. And you mentioned that using counterterrorism in the Philippines as a foot in the door was very important for a whole of government kind of Indo-PACOM rivalry approach. How do you sit, or from where you sit, how does India seem in terms of kind of a similar approach? They have terrorism problems within their borders that we could definitely probably help them with. And their army right now could stop the Chinese army if it came to it. So in my mind, that's kind of an invaluable partner that we could have in the region. What strategic resources are we dedicating to cultivate that partnership? And do you think that's a valuable thing that we should be pursuing?
Yeah. I went for all the reasons you're saying. I was just in India about 6 months ago.
Oh, great.
We actually put a SOCOM full-time officer with the Indian Special Operations Forces, because it is an important relationship, and they're in key terrain, but they're also a tremendous partner for us. And I actually, as a young student, I went to India and spent a couple weeks with them. But I think it's this is a relationship. India's been aligned with Russia for a long time, and I think we have to understand that. And I think we have to give them space. But we got to continue to offer partnerships, continue to work with them, because I think they're a key regional partner. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Ma'am, do you have anything to continue to add on to that?
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. It is having a clear-eyed perspective, because India, is the world's most populous democracy. There's a lot of things that we have in common with India, and would be a fantastic partnership. There are tensions underpinning U.S.-Indian relationships, including long, partnerships with Pakistan, and then also the Indian, how close they've been with Russia, since their independence. So it's the understanding that, which the general said, is key to understanding that. But again, I think embracing the fact that this is a very complicated political and military world that we're living in, and that the Indians certainly appreciate that, and I think there would be an opportunity there. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Come find me afterwards. Since you asked the first question, you get a SOCOM coin.
Good job, Charlie. Sir, ma'am, I was wondering, you both spoke a little bit about how different adversaries have vastly different weaknesses and pain points. For countering terrorist organizations or insurgencies, it's almost always useful to back the existing state authority. Yet many of these states seem to be increasingly diplomatically and economically aligned with China, particularly in places like the Sahel or now even the Middle East. Are there any risks to using our own irregular warfare capabilities to bolster states that are increasingly perhaps aligned with our great power competitors?
It's an outstanding question. Absolutely. I think it's a cost, there's always, I don't know. I often think of policymaking as choosing between bad and worse, right? Like it's like there hardly ever is there just one obvious great answer. So it would be in terms of balance and partnerships and trying to figure out just as our allies, I mentioned that, a local ally or trying to manage us, we're also managing them, right? So I think it would take like excellent intelligence, assessments of risk, and then balancing those factors. But I also think that if we just retreat from those types of engagements, then we really are ceding the field to Russia and to China, as you mentioned.
I just tag on. We have to go in clear-eyed and know what the risk and the real threat is and assess that. And if, and you name a place like the Sahel as an example, where I was just there a couple weeks ago in Niger and Cote d'Ivoire. I think we really have to look, what is that specific threat and what is good enough to disrupt that threat so that it doesn't grow to be such a threat, to be able to come back to roost to vital U.S. interests. And so we have to look at it as a whole. But a lot of people will go country by country in the Sahel. ISIS, Boko Haram, they're not looking country by country. They're looking across broad swaths of territory that are crossing Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. And I think we do it to our own discord if we're just looking at country. But we do have to understand what the threat is from proxies from other countries. And we just have to continue to work with those partners like Niger, where we've been for over a decade. And really we have to continue to emphasize what we're for, okay? What we're for as a U.S. and not what we're against. And they, when we talk to partners, they greatly appreciate that. I don't walk in and go, hey, let's look at what some nefarious actor is doing. Let's talk about what's in your interest first. Okay, thanks. Great question.
Thank you.
Sir, ma'am, you've been talking about the difference between how Americans perceive our adversaries' actions and what Americans expect from our adversaries compared to citizens in those countries. Do you think that America, as a democracy that prioritizes free speech and the value of individual life, is uniquely vulnerable to Russian informational warfare campaigns on the internet in general and on social media specifically, when the Russian populace is so used to having false information from their government and kind of used to being speculative of the information that they are given? And if so, how can we defend against this? And would the definitions potentially of our democracy or our definitions of freedom need to change in order to truly effectively defend against this?
Yes. No, and you know what, I'd say yes and. I think, yes, we are open to that. I wouldn't change it because I think we still live in the best country in the world because of those freedoms and because of that democracy. I would also, to your point on inside Russia, it's not that they're used to false information. Sometimes they don't get any information because the internet's cut off. They don't have access to it. I think the one thing that we have to look at is how do we actually make sure that misinformation and disinformation is countered across the board, and not just targeting our own U.S. citizens, but those like-minded allies and partners are with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the question because it is a huge concern, right? It gets to our safety and our values. But I think I think Americans are uniquely vulnerable in the short term, but I don't think as much in the long term. I think it's going to take some learning, and especially citizens and as a civilian, I could say this, as consumers, civilians are going to have to get a bit more savvy and empowered to figure out what information is accurate and what information is misleading. So I do think that that just as we were talking about how the national security landscape is getting more complicated, also life as a civilian is getting more complicated, and empowering civilians as consumers is going to be a key part of that. But I also think in the long run, it's a tremendous, tremendous asset, just a security asset. Not even like that we value these things tremendously, but also that even as it's an asset to be a democracy and to actually be presenting truth and agency. And in the long run, I think that is our probably our greatest, I don't want to call it a weapon, but is our greatest asset in terms of even our security, that we have that and that we're going to stand behind that, even if it does create some short-term vulnerabilities. I mean, we're talking a lot about Ukraine, for example, and the information and misinformation and lack of information that is existing in Russia right now. And just, again, as a civilian, I'm just wondering what even, not even civilians in Russia, but what does even Putin know at this point? Like, how accurate is he getting information? Not that I'm actually, but it's like even that in terms of decision making, and that's a huge asset that we have, that they've totally written off and they're going in the opposite direction. So.
Great question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Dr. Elias, General Clarke, you both mentioned the importance of kind of winning the narrative in the information space, and then also, the value of having those trusted partners to, validate the intel we get and ensure that it is like high quality and actionable. I've kind of worked a little bit in the urban warfare space, especially being so close to New York, and I'll say it terrifies me a little bit, especially, we're talking about how complicated of an issue this is. And, we're not necessarily talking about it in an urban landscape either. And especially given like global trends of urbanization, kind of the direction that all of that's going in. Can you speak a little bit to like, we're talking right now, like how challenging these issues are already. How do we even begin to, approach these topics when you're, if 10% of the folks in Manhattan don't like you, you're looking at an army of like 100,000 people. You're never going to win that with, mass. A lot of our like technological assets get negated. You can't drop artillery rounds, and unless you're the Russians, you can't drop artillery rounds in, an urban environment like that. So where do we even begin to approach that challenge set?
One, I think we got to be honest, and we got to be forthright, and you got to be first. I think one of the key things for us is you got to be first with the truth, and then you got to continuously follow up. And I think that is, and Dr. Elias was just hitting on this with the last question. Because we have an open democracy with free press, there may be some that disbelieve, but in the end, you're still going to be okay if as long as you don't shut down those things. And we continue to do it. All I have to do is look at the number of people who still want to come to this great country, the amount of immigrants who are still signing up. Guess what? They're not signing up to go to some of those other countries we've talked about tonight because of what we provide. And yes, there may be some pockets, even if it's 10%, but I'll trade that any day to be able to serve in this military in particular, but for this country more broadly, because I think it's important. And we just have to be consistent. We got to, truthfully, all of you as future leaders in our Army, need you to be optimistic and continue to say how important it is to be able to serve in this country.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would back that up, and then also talk about that the divisiveness within the United States also very much is in the skill set and capability set that's being pushed upon the United States by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, a number of different actors doing that. So I think that more conversations about that, again, on the civilian side, on the consumer side of social media, for example, media in general, needs to happen to say, where are you getting your information? And then to really come out with the truth first, and to have those broader conversations within society, since that society is the target, that society also has to have a response to that.
Thank you both.
Thanks.
Sorry, ma'am. So you talked about how the importance of friendly relations with foreign countries. I talked about India and sending a SOCOM representative there. I would like to ask, do you think the friendly relationships with foreign countries are now more important than they've ever been due to technological advancements that could potentially cause more damage than they have been compared to the last couple decades?
I do. And, we have about, we have over almost 6,000 people today in about 80 countries because of the importance of partnering and be able to see and sense and be with partners, training with them, sharing our values, and I think it sends them the U.S. message about how important they are to us when we're willing to send our military, our U.S. citizens to train with them. And in our case, we're sending the best and brightest of our special operations forces to partner alongside them. And I think that sends that message. And you raised the idea of technology in this. I still put that our greatest asset is our human capital. We have 5 SOCOM truths, and truth number 1 in SOCOM is humans are more important than hardware. And that human capital of our people, because if you're willing to put your people and train with others, I think there's nothing better.
Yes, sir. Anything else, ma'am?
Yeah, well, just quickly, I think to build on that because we're looking at increasing the highly political forms of warfare, we also need very smart, targeted, context-specific responses. And so we need excellent intelligence and excellent partners that can provide us the type of data that we need to make the best choice possible. And so I do think that because we're looking at very complicated political issues, there's not a one-size-fits all for any political circumstance. And so you really need people on the ground who understand that. And that's going to be very difficult as foreigners to have that information. So I do think those partnerships are key.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Sir, ma'am, thank you for being with us. So my question, Section 230 largely relieves private sector internet companies from liability for content that's being posted on their platforms by third-party users, aside from a certain set of objectionable material under a certain set of criteria. You both talked about the importance of dis and misinformation that's being spread on said platforms, and with regard to that and its importance not only for our domestic politics and the integrity of our democracy on the inside, but also from a defense point of view, as great power competition moves more towards this asymmetric form of warfare, what obligations or duties do you think private sectors have in that sense? And as we see companies like Microsoft actually launching their own campaigns against Russia and Ukraine, what is their role moving forward?
Yeah. So I do think that there would be a place for, well, 2 things. I think that that private sector corporations would have an obligation to have very thoughtful policies in place. This is really tricky territory, though, because you're also talking about forms of censorship, right, which then goes against the very heart of free speech. But if there is free speech that's being done intentionally, maliciously by foreign governments, then is that really protected free speech? There needs to be big conversations about that and about the responsibility that those corporations have. I do think that, though, there also needs to be a push towards the demand side of it, which is, again, the consumer piece of it, the civilian piece of it, to say, I don't want that content, right? Like, they are providing a service, and as a corporation, as a business, if that's something that people are turning away from platforms for because of disinformation, then that speaks loudly to them as well, right? So I think it's going to take not just kind of these big companies and big corporations being responsible, but I also think that there's impetus on us as social media consumers to also demand things that are more accurate, because our democracy is also, affected by that tremendously. So I think that there's lots of responsibility here too.
The only great answer. The only thing I would put in for the corporations, that I think they have to look long-term and look at risk. And what could this do, the risk to their being able to operate inside the U.S., given what nefarious actors could hold the U.S. and therefore hold their ability to operate as companies. And I think that if they approach it from the long term and not the short term, I think it'll be in everybody's best interest.
Thank you both.
Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to mix things up real quick. We're going to get to your question, promise, but we're going to take a question from online. And I'm pretty sure this one's directed to you, General Clarke, from a USMA grad. Should we refocus the special ops community to de-emphasize the direct action pieces and emphasize those better able to conduct the low-intensity conflict missions throughout the world?
And I'd say yes, and it has already occurred. And I'm glad for the question, because everybody does know special ops, the Bin Laden raid or the raid on Baghdadi. That's a minor part to what we do, whether it's foreign internal defense, whether it's security forces, whether it's unconventional warfare, whether it's MISO, whether it's civil affairs, whether it's strategic reconnaissance. I could go on. It's the legends of the raid, but it is not what we're all about. And I think it's that long-term persistent engagement, working with foreign partners. Here we are with the Irregular Warfare podcast. That's going to make the long-term difference. We can't kill our way out of this. We cannot kill our way out of these fights. We have to take a long-term interagency and whole of government approach, working with partners. So
goes back to your Philippines example.
Exactly. Great. Thanks for the question.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Sir, ma'am. Speaking of long-term, right? I'm gonna bring up Ukraine again. My question is, we were told, we had a panel before we went on spring leave, and we were told that Russia's not using 100% of their army, right? Obviously, they're taking heavy losses. My question is, to what extent will they go on? And is this a short-term plan for like a longer game? Do they want more territory to add, maybe regain the lost territory of the Soviet Union, maybe go back to Georgia, 2008, right? To what extent are they willing to go? Because they're taking mass casualties, right? That's part one of my question. And kind of second part of that question is—
It's a two-part.
A lot of economic sanctions and a lot of international companies came out of Russia because of this invasion of Ukraine. Do you think Russia's going to start producing all these things in Russia, or how are they going to respond to that? Because like, if you can't go to the store and buy the stuff that you could before, like, to what impact is that going to have on Russia?
So it's hard to know, right, in terms of so Putin has shown that he is risk acceptance, but I also think that this war has gone horribly from many perspectives, obviously first and foremost for the Ukrainians, but even also this has not gone according to Putin's plan. So in terms of the number of casualties, I think the Defense Intelligence Agency estimated it was 2,000, 4,000 recently, which is significant casualties. You're absolutely right. Now, the problem with that is that then that puts, in terms of you wondering what Putin is thinking, and I don't think anyone in the world knows what Putin is thinking at this exact moment, but that kind of puts some pressure to have some sort of victory. I don't know what that would look like, if that's carving out part of Ukraine or not carving out part of Ukraine. But then at the same time, clearly, though, the casualties are mounting and the costs are mounting, and the financial and economic impact on Russia is enormous at this point, according to Global Response. So it's hard to say exactly where this will go, but almost as it becomes more costly, it almost may unfortunately push Vladimir Putin to invest more in it to justify it. That's a fear, at least, that I would have about that. In terms of companies, I think there will be some sort of attempt to have state responses to try to fill in the blanks. But I think at the end of the day, Moscow is going to turn to China and ask for assistance, and that benefits China tremendously, because now they have this great state, in terms of the power competition. Now they have Russia that they can also make demands on, because now Russia is going to be increasingly dependent on China in that factor. So I think we'll see those pieces moving a bit more. But obviously, I don't know nearly as much as the general does about this.
Yeah, I think a lot of your question is still too early to tell. And because Russia still has mass, and they still have significant amount of combat power. Yes, they're taking casualties. Yes, it's been much slower than the military assumptions were going in. Their assumption was, 3 to 7 days, Kiev surrounded, government taken over. But I think it should be instructive for all of us that the approach that Russia has taken is to seize the entire country. And, just look at the way that they're attacking, to seize the entire country and take it over. But I think what this has done, this is galvanized NATO. It has been very clear from a U.S. policy and NATO perspective that there will be not 1 inch of NATO territory gained out of this. So I think on that side, we're in a good spot. What I obviously think about every day, and I think all of us do, is for the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian armed forces, and what they're doing and fighting for their lives every day. And I don't think we can discount that. I think economically, this is going to, we're closing their own stock market again. This is going to have tremendous repercussions, could have long-term impacts for Russia. I think the key will be ensuring that those sanctions remain in place. So thanks for a tough question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right, so we have several minutes left. We have, if my eyes are telling me right, I think we have 6 cadets who are lined up for questions.
Quick round.
So I think let's ask 2 questions, quick responses, and see how many we can get through.
Okay.
So if you could ask your question, and then the gentleman behind you, if you could ask your question, and then we'll pause.
Well, thank you for your time this evening. Looking back and reflecting on our 2 decades in Afghanistan, primarily focused on COIN, what lessons learned and generational knowledge can we pass down onto junior officers when we move into the more conventional warfare and great power competition sphere? When we select new non-state future partner forces, what can we do differently to have a more effective conflict in that battle space?
Okay, next question.
Oh, next question. Go ahead.
Yep.
Sir, I was curious if you could speak about the fundamental differences between SOCOM and JSOC's mission set in an irregular war counterterrorism operation, and what role does one fill that the other can't?
All right. So JSOC and SOCOM, JSOC works for SOCOM. JSOC is primarily a counterterrorism force, but don't ever discount that counterterrorism is not and direct action is not part of irregular warfare. Is where I put to the Afghan question. I'd go back to don't try to create militaries in your own image, and understand limitations and constraints of your partner forces, and ensure that that partner force is in fact tied, where's that tied to the military? And I could put it like, don't try to fight 1 year at a time. It doesn't help for campaign continuity.
Yeah, it's fair. And I'll just take the Afghanistan piece of it. I think one of the key lessons, there's many lessons in Afghanistan, like many in that. I think we should all work on that collectively. But one of the things I would say that comes to the top of my mind is thinking about how we have to push harder on what we mean by key terms. And you did this earlier when you were like, okay, so make them pay, but how and what does that mean? But exactly that. So a lot of the counterinsurgency field manual, for example, has a lot of things that sound like they make a lot of sense, but what does it actually mean when it's actually applied on a tactical level? And how feasible is it? And in a long term, is it sustainable? So what do terms like legitimacy mean in that context? That's where the art and difficulty lies. So I think don't just nod your head to things that sound about right, but we don't know what they actually look like. I'd say for learning, really push hard and push back on what things might mean. If it sounds easy, but you think it's not, you're right. It's not easy. So push harder and try to puzzle through things.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Okay, let's do two more.
In terms of security force assistance, we have multiple different organizations, SF, SFAB, that do work in a lot of places, but different resources are dedicated to these organizations. Human capital and training are different for both. Is there an echelon that we train overseas that works better for foreign security forces? And is there a point when we should stop dedicating these resources, or where it doesn't make sense to dedicate these resources to our partners?
Yeah. Hey, all right, go ahead. Next question. Maybe we do three.
Let's do three. Sounds good.
Okay.
Sir, ma'am. With different groups inside of the United States forming that possibly could be against the United States government, what's the threat of those near-peer adversaries using those against ourselves?
Sir, earlier on you talked about how kinetic action against rivals is not the only thing that SOCOM can do. There's also a lot of non-kinetic deterrents that we take advantage of. But just using the war in Russia and Ukraine as an example, the war is still relatively early. We haven't gotten to see a lot of the effects of this non-kinetic deterrence. But how does the decision-making process work whenever it's looking like non-kinetic deterrence might not be enough, and actors such as Russia are still continuing their attack despite non-kinetic deterrence taking place?
Yeah, great questions. I'll take first stab, go backwards.
Yep.
Hey, on the kinetic, non-kinetic, what's going on in Ukraine is very kinetic. I'm not going to try to argue against it, but I would also posit that the non-kinetic is critical. Look at what President Zelensky is doing every day. He is doing outreach. He's talking to our Congress. He's talking across. This is the old Clausewitz. The moral to the physical is 3 to 1. He is galvanizing a nation through non-kinetic activity. And truthfully, if you look at some of the Ukrainians are spending a significant amount of effort on the internet, countering Russia misinformation and disinformation. All you do is look at all the videos and all the TikToks and all the things that are out there are significant, and it is assisting. I would argue it's making a significant difference when they're showing captured Russian citizens, soldiers, and then getting those back into Russia, for conscripts. So I don't think we can ever, today, I don't think we can discount that. On the second piece, and I can almost tie it in. Yeah, I do think that Russia and China are trying to influence us. In particular, Russia. I mean, 2016, 2018, 2020 elections. They absolutely are. And I think we really have to look at that. That happened on the internet, but it's through cyber. And we have to look how we counter. On the SFAB, the Security Force Advisory Brigade, really important because those efforts can do many things. They can advise at the tactical level, but they also, depending upon the needs of a specific country, they're advising at the operational and sometimes even at the strategic level, and really on the conventional side. It's a great organization where mainly SOF or SOCOM forces are advising with other SOF forces. The Security Force Advisory are really working with the institutional and the conventional. And it really helped. I see that as a good match. So sorry I went quick on 3 questions, but trying to stay for speed round.
Yeah.
Perfect. I need to call Major Atwell up here while he's making his way up here. I just want to thank both of our panelists for tonight, and also to the audience here for all the great questions that all of you had, and the question that was submitted online. If you're looking for more resources on this topic, there's SOCOM Softcast, which is a great resource. There's recent publications by the Joint Special Operations University that's also looking at some of these topics. There's obviously the IWI podcast and the work of the Modern Warfare Institute and the work at the Combating Terrorism Center. So it's been a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. I'll turn it over to Kyle.